Alright, in this video we're going to look at how to solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Now, take a moment to copy this down. This is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And I know this looks weird and confusing at first, but as we work through a few examples, you're going to see that using this formula is a very nice and standard way of finding the x-intercepts of a parabola or solving a quadratic equation. Now, this is another thing that we have to have or be aware of. Okay, all of our quadratic equations have to be in this standard form in order for us to use our quadratic formula. And that is just ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It means all of our terms have to be on the same side and it must equal 0. Again, we're trying to find the x-intercepts of our parabola. We're trying to figure out when our equation or our expression equals 0. So it must equal 0. If it equals anything other than 0, we just have to make it equal to 0. So this then tells us our a, b, and c, and we substitute those numbers in to our formula. So let's look at an example. Okay, so let's say we want to solve 2x squared plus 15x minus 8 equals 0. Okay, first thing we notice, this is a quadratic equation because we have this x squared term. Okay, then we want to make sure, does it equal 0? Yes, it equals 0. So now we could use our quadratic formula. Okay, so maybe we could solve this by factoring using the zero product property, but the nice thing about the quadratic formula is it always works. Okay, some equations or some expressions we realize that we can't factor it, but using the quadratic formula we'll always find these x-intercepts, even if they're weird decimals. So the very first thing we want to do is we want to identify what is our a value, what is our b value, what is our c value. Well, a is just the coefficient of x squared. So here we have 2x squared, so a equals 2. Okay, b is just our x term, so b equals 15 because we have 15x, and c equals, well, we have minus 8, so c equals negative 8. Okay, so we identified our a, b, and our c. So now what we want to do is you just want to take the time to neatly and appropriately substitute these values into this formula, because no matter what formula we have, whenever we're given the values, we just substitute it into our formula. So we're going to do the opposite of b. So we have x equals, meaning our x-intercepts are the opposite of b. So we're going to do the opposite of 15. We're not going to skip any steps for now, so we're just going to do the opposite of 15. Now this symbol means plus or minus. We know we have two x-intercepts, and we're going to get 1 by adding in our formula. Then we got to do the whole formula again and subtract. That's how we get our two x-intercepts, by doing it twice. So we're going to do plus once and then minus later on. Okay, so for now we just include the plus or minus, and we'll deal with doing them separately at the very end. The square root of b squared, so we're going to do 15 squared, minus, because it's part of the formula, 4, because it's part of the formula, times our a value, and our a value is 2, times our c value, which is negative 8. And we can't forget that we're dividing this value, this whole quantity, by 2 times our a value. So 2, because it's part of the formula, times the 2 that our a equals. Okay, so that wasn't too bad. We just substituted in our values, took our time, into our formula. Now what we need to do here is we need to be careful. Okay, there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, so we don't want to do too much on our calculator, because if we try to do too much on our calculator, we're going to make mistakes. There's a lot of stuff going on here, so you're going to have a lot of parentheses on your calculator, and it's hard to keep track of. So the very first thing we do, or I like having us do, is just what's underneath this square root. We just type in this 15 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 8. We don't do the square root yet, we just do what's underneath the square root. So when we type this into our calculator, this is all we're doing. 15 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 8. We're just doing what's underneath. We hit equals, and we find that that is 289. So we have x equals, well now I know the opposite of 15 is just negative 15. We have plus or minus. We still have this square root because we didn't take the square root of anything yet. And we know that inside equals 289. And then we're dividing this by 2 times 2, and 2 times 2 is 4. Okay, now is when we break it up and do it separately. Okay, so this looks a little bit simpler, and this is what's easier to type into your calculator. So what we do is we do negative 15 plus the square root of 289, hit equals, and then divide by 4. So let's do that. Negative 15 plus, now the square root is second x squared, 289. So this is what we type in. We hit equals, and we get 2, and then we just divide it by 4. Okay, we have to hit equals first because order of operations says we have to do the numerator before we do that division. So then we just divide the answer by 4, and we get 0.5. And you know I like fractions better, so we're going to say x equals 1/2. Okay, we know this is one of our x-intercepts, and we got this by adding. Now the reason why we do this in a couple of steps is now we don't have to do the whole formula again. All we have to do is this part again, and now we have to subtract. Okay, this 1/2 came from adding, and now we want to subtract. So we're just going to do negative 15 minus. The only thing that changes is this plus changes to a minus. It's still negative 15. We're still dividing by a positive 4. The only thing that changes is the plus changes to a minus. We have negative 15 minus the square root of 289, hit equals, and then we're dividing this by 4, and we get x equals negative 8. So these are the two x-intercepts, and that's it. That's using the quadratic formula. Okay, so let's do one more together before you try one on your own. So let's say we want to solve x squared minus 6x plus 3 equals 0. Okay, again, we notice this is a quadratic equation because we see this x squared term. The next thing we want to make sure, does it equal 0? Because it must equal 0, and yes, it does equal 0. So now let's identify what is a equal, what is b equal, what is c equal. Now a is our coefficient of x squared. Now we don't want to say it's 0 because we do have an x squared term. Okay, we do have an x squared, and we have one of them. So a equals 1, b equals negative 6. Remember, whenever you see a minus, you treat that number as being negative. So b equals negative 6, and c equals 3. Okay, so for this example, a equals 1, b equals negative 6, and c equals 3, but the formula is the exact same. So we're going to take our time and neatly substitute everything into our quadratic formula. So x, meaning the solutions, equal the opposite of b, so we're doing the opposite of negative 6, the opposite of negative 6, and we're not skipping steps yet, not until we get good, plus or minus the square root of b squared. Now this is where it's most important to remember you're substituting in negative 6 for b. Okay, so you're doing negative 6 squared. So that negative 6 has to be in parentheses because we want to do negative 6 times negative 6. This is where most students make mistakes. You have to put the negative 6, negative numbers, inside parentheses when you're squaring it, and that exponent has to be on the outside of the parentheses. Minus 4 times a is 1 times c is 3. And we're all dividing this whole thing by 2 times our a value. Now again, we want to make sure we're typing it in correctly, so we do what's underneath the square root first. So we do our negative 6 in parentheses, so we do negative 6, close the parentheses, square it, minus 4 times 1 times 3. And we get 24. Okay, so now we start making this expression simpler. The opposite of negative 6 is positive 6, plus or minus the square root of 24, divided by 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, so we're going to type this into our calculator. First time we're going to do it with addition, so we have 6 plus the square root of 24. And we hit equals first, and then we divide by 2. Now we're not afraid of this weird decimal. We know sometimes we do get weird decimals. That's why we like the quadratic formula. It means we couldn't have factored this. So what we use here is because we see a long weird decimal. Okay, remember this is called an irrational number because there's no number that times itself that equals 24, or no whole number that times itself equals 24. So we use our squiggly equals. Okay, just a little wavy equal sign. So x is approximately 5.45, and we round to 2 decimal places. Again, we use this here because we rounded. We didn't use squiggly equals here because these were exact answers. We used the squiggly equals when we round. Okay, so that was adding. Remember, we're not done yet, so we have to do it again with subtracting. So we have 6 minus the square root of 24. We hit equals. We divide by 2, and we get x is also approximately 0.55. Okay, so these are the two answers. And as you can see, there's really not a whole lot of steps here. Okay, we just identify what our variables are. That's one step, which is very easy. We take our time and substitute it in neatly, which is quick once we get the practice. We remember we're including negative numbers inside parentheses, especially if we're squaring it. We do what's underneath the square root first, and then we have to remember to do this twice, once with adding, once with subtracting. Okay, so why don't you try this last one on your own by pressing pause, and then press play when you're ready to check it. You're solving this using the quadratic formula. Okay, so we have a quadratic equation. It equals 0, so let's identify our values that we're substituting in. A equals 3, B equals 1, C equals -4. So x equals the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. Okay, underneath the square root first, so we do 1 squared minus 4 times 3 times -4, and we get 49, so we have -1. So x equals -1 plus or minus the square root of 49 divided by 6. And we just do this on our calculator. -1 plus the square root of 49. Okay, this is what it should look like. We hit equals first, and then we divide by 6, and we get x equals 1. Okay, no squiggly equals because 1's a number that we didn't have to round. And we do this again. -1 minus the square root of 49 equals -8. Divided by 3 equals -2.6 repeating. Okay, you could keep this as a repeating decimal. Don't round because we know how to write repeating decimals. Or you could say this is -2 2/3. Okay, and that's how we use the quadratic formula. So for more practice, refer to some of the other online resources or the textbook.